Hi, everyone. This is Julie Harris Walker, host of the Catch a Break podcast. As we're rolling out season 2 of Catch a Break, we want to note that all of it was recorded before COVID-19 happened, production shut down, and everything changed. And it brings up a lot of questions like, where do we go from here? Well, we're going to address all the questions being brought up as this industry figures out how to go back to work in a world where everything is different. We're doing a series of live podcast recordings with video starting May 28th and running every Thursday for 4 weeks at 1 p.m. Pacific time. You can join us. Go to catchabreakpodcast.com and click on the live COVID-19 speaker series page, and we will send you the links to join us for those very timely conversations. And now back to season 2 of Catch a Break. Hello, and welcome to the Catch a Break podcast, the insider's guide to breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry. Season 2 of Catch a Break is brought to you by Cachet, the production credit card. Manage your cards and spend in real time and get cash back on every dollar you spend on your show with Cachet. I'm Julie Harris Walker, and today on the podcast we'll be talking about incentives with Amy Lemish and Joe Chianese. Amy Lemish was the longest-serving executive director of the California Film Commission from 2004 to 2019, where she oversaw the state's efforts to facilitate and grow film, television, and commercial production. In addition to administering California's multi-billion-dollar film and television tax credit program, she oversaw a wide range of support services and coordinated with all levels of government to create a film-friendly environment. Prior to her work at the Film Commission, she served for more than 15 years as producer for Penny Marshall's company, Parkway Productions. And now Amy is working at Netflix. Joey Chianese is Executive Vice President at Entertainment Partners. Joe provides production and legislative consulting, financial, tax, and administrative services for both domestic and international production incentives for film and television. Joe has over 35 years of accounting, government affairs, production, and tax experience, including positions at Sony Pictures Entertainment, the Walt Disney Company, the ABC Television Network, Paramount Pictures, and Ernst & Young. Collectively, throughout Joe's career, he has been responsible for the tax and finance structuring for domestic and international film and television productions. Now, just a quick disclaimer. We recorded this episode nearly a year ago before COVID-19 was even a thing, so some of it may sound very dated, but we think there are enough nuggets in here that are really valuable, so we're going to go ahead and release this episode on incentives. Okay, so I'm going to start with Amy Lemish. Amy, I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you very much.
Tell us, what was your first job and how did you get it?
My first job was working for the director Penny Marshall.
We've heard of her.
Started working for her before her first directing job, but so I was there from the very beginning and worked on all of her feature films.
It's amazing. How did you get that job in the first place?
A friend of a friend connection, that sort of thing, and I was the shopper, gopher, cigarette fetcher. Basically, was my job initially,
and if you read Penny's book, which I've read, My Mother Was Nuts, Amy is referenced many times.
That's funny. Well, that brings us to Joe Chianese. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
What was your first job and how did you get it?
Professional job or like job?
Job in the industry.
Job in the industry. So my first job technically in the industry was for the ABC studios, even though I had worked for Ernst & Young for a number of years and had many studio clients.
So you came up as a CPA?
I did. And I worked for Ernst & Young for a little over 10 years and it was at Paramount for a little while. So actually my first job, but it wasn't doing really entertainment work. I was doing sales and use tax and property tax returns for Paramount. And my boss at the time said, "You're really smart." People don't say that to me very often. And he said, "You probably shouldn't be doing this. You should think about going into public accounting and really learn tax and then come back." So he helped me get a job. And originally he wanted me to go to Price Waterhouse. And I ended up going to Ernst & Whinney, which became Ernst & Young. But yes, I've had really interesting clients. I learned the business at Ernst & Whinney and Ernst & Young, not just because I had clients like the ABC network and I had Paramount and Warner Brothers, but I had fun clients like New Line before they got acquired by Warner Brothers and Miramax before they got acquired by Disney. So I really learned about independent film and it was really a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Now we're here today to talk about film incentives. Now, if we had to start from, I've never heard of what's a film incentive. Like, Amy, can you give us kind of the overview 101? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So when you're making a film nowadays, you're looking at your budget first and foremost and how to stretch those dollars. And I don't know, seems like 99% of the projects nowadays are looking to a state or federal incentive to reduce their costs, or rather it adds to the financing structure, right? Which I know Joe can address in more detail. But so there's a variety of, they're all similar, but they have different structures. There's rebates, there's refundable credits, there's transferable credits, and there's non-transferable credits. But they all pretty much work in a similar way where it's based on a percentage of your production spending. And you take that and somehow monetize that credit. If it's a refund or transferable, you'd sell it. You might have to get a bank loan in advance against the future sale of that credit. But it's essentially used as one of your financing sources.
Do you have anything to add to that?
That's a great explanation. A lot of people call it soft money, free money, because it's technically money that you don't have to repay. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times when clients call, especially independents, and they're getting ready to do a project, the first thing I say, well, do you have your money yet? And they go, well, no. And I said, well, let's start from the beginning. Do you have a budget? And if they have a budget, I help them at least estimate what a credit might or a rebate might be. So they may end up, not realizing it, have 20 to 40% of their budget covered by virtue of an incentive. And then typically they can come to companies like mine, and we can give them a bank letter, or we can finance that up front, and then they can go out to other folks to get money to finance the rest of the movie.
So it can be one of the pieces of their financing structure. What are the hotspots right now of where's a good incentive? Where's everybody going?
Well, I mean, in the U.S. right now, there's around 35 jurisdictions with incentives, and tracking this back to the beginning when it started in 2001, I guess, in the U.S. At one point, it was probably 2007 or 8, there was probably 42, 45 states, so it's scaled back quite a bit.
Remember Michigan?
Yes. But in the U.S. right now, California is actually a very populous jurisdiction. There's a great incentive with not a lot of money allocable each year, but what helps that is that there's crew and there's infrastructure here, and people don't have to travel, so people love to stay in California. But Georgia is very busy. New York is very busy. Massachusetts, Louisiana. I get this question a lot. What are the top 10? I like to say there's a top 35, and then let's talk about your project, because there's always the right jurisdiction for the right project.
So, Amy, can you talk about the California incentive?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you only invented it.
So ours is a combination of transferable and non-transferable, non-refundable. So the way that works is if it is a studio project, they get a tax credit. It is not refundable. It is not transferable. They can't sell it, so they can't monetize it. But for a studio company, they have tax liability in California, so the credit is used to reduce what they owe. So let's say you owe $10 million in state taxes, but you get a tax credit for $5 million, you're only going to owe $5 million. So that's essentially how it works for them. If it's an independent project in the California system, they can sell that credit. So if they get a $1 million tax credit, they can then take that piece of paper and sell it to a high net worth individual or a corporation who does have a tax liability in California, and they sell at a very, very high number. So Joe can probably address this, but they call it the discount. So if you have $1 million tax credit, is that really $1 million value? No.
Right.
It's going to be about a $900,000 value, because the person buying it isn't buying it for the full amount. But the discount is rather low. So they've been selling it around 94 cents on the dollar in California.
That sounds really high to me.
Yeah, because there's not a lot for sale. So there's a high demand for them.
And California doesn't have a lot of other credits to sell. Other states do. So in terms of credits to buy, the California film credit is very valuable.
Because other states are, in the 80s?
Well, no. I mean, it depends. I mean, it's supply and demand. I mean, right now, Georgia is about 87, net 87. Going back to what Amy said, nobody pays a dollar for a dollar, so you're basically paying what the market will bear. So there's points where Georgia was in the low 90s, but there's a lot of volume that's affecting pricing. There's states like Louisiana used to guarantee you 85 cents on the dollar, or you could sell it. They've now changed that. You can't sell it, but they guarantee you 88. The only state that still guarantees you a dollar value is Massachusetts. Will guarantee you 90 cents on the dollar. So it's really, there's only about 12 jurisdictions maybe with transferable credits, and that includes Puerto Rico. So,
are there any places where it's really hard to sell your credit now?
No, it's not. Well, I would say Georgia, only because there's a lot of volume. There's a lot of volume, and so they're selling, but they're not selling at the price maybe that somebody budgeted. So when we're talking to clients and we're saying they're going to Georgia, I say you should probably budget at 85.
Yeah.
So if you come in higher, you're a superstar. But if you come in lower, you have to explain why you didn't get it.
So that's an interesting point, right? It's really important to look at what you're really getting, right? So you're not getting $1 million, you're getting 850,000 in that scenario. Plus, you might be spending more to go somewhere.
Right.
So, for instance, you asked about the California program. So a big distinction here versus a lot of our other competitors in the U.S. is that ours is a smaller credit. So California doesn't give the credit on any above-the-line expenditures. Writer, actor, director, producer, salaries.
Because that would take all the money.
That's excluded from the calculation for the credits. Not so in Georgia. All of those salaries, you would get that 30% on. However, what I find a lot of people don't do is they don't do a true apples to apples budget to look at how much more they are spending to go to a place like Georgia. And you think you're going to only bring your department heads and you're going to pick up everybody else, but it never happens. They get there and then they don't have enough crew, and so they're flying in and housing more crew than they anticipated. Maybe they're shipping in more equipment than they anticipated. So I think it's really important to do a very accurate budget comparison before you make a decision on where to go.
So how do you find out that information? If you're thinking, I'm going to Georgia, I'm going to assume I'm going to pick everybody up, but somebody knows, you know what? They are so busy, you can't even get a crew there. You're going to have to bring everybody.
You have to talk to the last person that just worked there. I mean,
The film commissions are a great resource. They'll tell you who's there, who's coming, or they should know. You talk to the last production that left or who's there to find out what's the crew base like. Going back to what Amy just said, most jurisdictions require that you buy the equipment locally. So if it's not there and you have to ship it in, not only do you have that cost, but it's not qualified.
Now, there used to be a lot of those purchasing companies where there was a company set up in the state that you could buy the equipment through. Is that still happening, or have those gone away?
Technically, they have gone away, not because, the legislation has changed. My company did that for a number of years to help the states as they were building infrastructure. But what's happening with the volume of production coming in, vendors are moving there. So there's less of a need, and states have changed their legislation to require that the vendor be a true vendor that doesn't just have bricks and mortar, but they actually have inventory.
Like they're a real business.
They're a real business, not necessarily inventory in the state, but if you're basically somebody who's leasing cars, you need to have cars somewhere in your balance sheet, and you're just not being a pass-through.
Okay. One of the questions we had was, there's so much talk in the business about diversity and representation. Has that trickled into any of the incentives yet? Is there any kind of requirement or piece in the incentives?
Not in any real impactful way. I know Illinois had a provision where you had to show that you made an effort to have more diversity in your hiring, but it wasn't like a quota. You can't, legislation, it's very difficult to have any sort of quotas when it's tied to tax. California recently implemented a change that just requires reporting on diversity. So it's not a quota, it's not a mandate, but it's a way to collect data moving forward as to what are the hiring practices and what's the diversity of the workforce.
So try to make people more conscious of it.
Yes.
What would it look like to make an effort? How does someone prove that?
In Illinois?
Yeah.
It's complicated, but there's forms. You basically have to just demonstrate that you went through a process of at least considering diverse employment. It is still a requirement, but you're not penalized for doing it. You just have to show the effort. It sounds strange, but that's all you really have to do.
You have to show that you're thinking about it.
Yes.
Baby steps.
Right.
And what Happened in New York for the writers? Did that pass?
That didn't pass, but there was something.
What had they proposed?
It was something I think an uplift for female writers. Wasn't it for female writers?
Oh, female and...
Was it female and people of color?
Minority writers, or yeah.
But it didn't pass.
It did not.
It did not pass.
Okay.
What typically, we've talked in a real general sense of what kind of things might qualify, but let's talk a little bit more specifically, like what kinds of things become qualified spend?
So, well, in California, like I said, the above the line writer, director, producer, actor salaries do not qualify, but essentially everything else does. So your entire crew, all of your equipment rentals, all of your purchases, it's everything, all of your whole post-production package. It's just those few salaries, and then anything that would be considered intangible, like rights, like licensing or life rights if you purchase a book, that wouldn't qualify. But all the nuts and bolts of actually making the project is qualified.
Is there a cap? Is there a budget limit? Like, what's the kind of sweet spot?
So in California, which is again different from most of the other states, for a feature film, the uppermost dollar amount that would be qualified is $100 million, and for an independent, it's $10 million of qualified spend.
Okay, and how do you qualify an independent? Does it have to have no studio involvement or financing?
It can't be owned by a publicly traded company, which means it's not owned by a studio.
Isn't owned by also not owned more than 25% by a publicly traded company as well.
Okay, that seems a little tricky.
It is. I mean, we have a lot of people who call and say, "How do I skirt that definition?" And you really can't. It's pretty specific.
Yeah. Okay, I think because of the current times we live in, we have to touch on, we see production going to different states and then states passing different laws that then makes people think about making different decisions about where we're going to go. Kind of, what do you kind of make of that climate right now?
Well, I think we should talk about North Carolina. I always like to bring it back to that because I forgot how many years ago when they were passing or about to pass that bathroom bill where you couldn't have transgender bathrooms, and it felt like overnight production left. It was like an exodus. Boom. Now they did not have nearly as much production as Georgia has now.
And infrastructure.
Right. I mean,
but I will say, but nothing, whatever they had hasn't come back even at the same volumes that it was. So.
Right, that's a good point. So I'm asked this a lot actually, and everyone's talking about Georgia now because that is the one of the biggest production centers now in the U.S. And now that they've passed the heartbeat bill, which has not yet been enacted,
and we're talking at the end of May right now, just for context.
Right. So, and it's being challenged in court and all of that. So who knows if it will ever come to pass? But there's a lot of talent certainly coming out saying, "I'm not going to work there." So I think it's definitely going to be a consideration for a lot of productions that are looking at where they're going now. I mean, I know it is. I'm talking to a lot of companies that it's now yet another factor on top of, do they have stages? Do they have a crew base? And do they have incentives? And now you have to look at, and do they have draconian laws that are about to come into play? So people are really taking a serious look at it.
So where are people looking now as an alternative to Georgia? I mean, we were saying earlier, we can't assume everyone's just going to come to California.
I mean, they are really tracking. I mean, just keeping it specific to the question, anytime there's a change in legislation, whether it's legislation related to the incentives or anything else, it's a disruption. And it's a disruption that could be an opportunity to some jurisdictions. So we were saying this before, if everyone left a state like Georgia, where would they go?
Right.
Because again, if you specifically tie it to these anti-abortion laws, I mean, Georgia seems to be sort of the target, but there are other states that passed. And so the question is,
I think we're up
if
to
not
8 today.
There, where? And then if there, do they have the infrastructure and crew to handle it? I was asking Amy, if everyone decided to leave and come back to California, could California handle it right now?
Right. Well, everybody wouldn't come to California is the thing. So we're not at full capacity in California, but we're busy. And, I was monitoring very closely what stages were being built and developed. And we do have actually several studios being built that'll be online in 2020, which is great.
Here?
Yeah. In Sun Valley, actually.
Great.
9 stages from one company. And then Quixote, I think, is building 5.
Wow.
So that's really great. But yeah, it would be a capacity issue for any place. So, that's not how it would happen. It would disperse. Some would go to New York, and some might go to Louisiana, of course, depending on what laws they're passing, and Canada too.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest risk for the country is that if there isn't a place to go here, it's more of an international play. I mean, Canada has been a very, very busy, solid production hub for a long time. They have very, very strong and very generous incentive programs, the UK as well. Let me go back to how California began and the whole concept of runaway productions. And correct me if I have the story wrong, but I mean, Sacramento waited a while before they did anything. It was only when television right, started to leave, which was the permanent jobs were permanently leaving. As going back to my beginnings of being a tax geek, California taxes California residents on their worldwide income. So they didn't care if you worked on a movie anywhere in the world because you came back home and you were still taxed on that income. Mm-hmm. When television moved, and I think wasn't it Ugly Betty that was the first?
Yeah.
Permanent jobs left the state. And they thought, oh my God, we're going to feel this in our tax revenues. And then I believe that was the beginning of the talk about we need to do something to stop the bleeding or make sure production stays or comes back.
Yeah, Amy, can you talk to those early days of the incentive? I know you were right there.
Sure. So we were later than almost all the other states in sort of getting into the incentive game.
Was there an issue with it because Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor and it looked like maybe it was too much of an insider thing?
Well, it was a couple things. So first of all, I think California was late because it was difficult to get legislators to understand that, like, they would say, well, why would we give that's our signature industry. Aren't they here anyway?
Right.
So it was being able to demonstrate, no, it's not here anyway. How much feature film production was leaving, how much television production was leaving, and to be able to track that and have the data to back it up, right? And at the same time, so Schwarzenegger was definitely supportive of implementing and starting an incentive program in the first iteration of the program started under his watch. It was a little tricky because he couldn't necessarily be out front on it with the legislature because critics would say, oh, this is just it
looks too personal.
Kick back to his old buddies in the industry, right?
Yeah.
So that it was challenging. So behind the scenes, he was very, very helpful, but he wasn't very visible up front on the issue.
And that just brings up a general theme that I address a lot from the very beginning, and that's the issue of perception around incentives. There is a perception, especially outside the industry, that this is giving money back to an industry that does not need it. And I always say that this is really a jobs creation act, and it's not going to, especially in California, it's not going to the higher paid individuals. And
it's not going to movie stars.
Right. And it's never going to them directly anyway. I mean, the reality is a movie star is a cost of production. I mean, and the studios don't set that price. It's supply and demand. But yes, the incentives help supplement those costs. Movies wouldn't get made if those costs weren't supplemented. And those movies create thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. And then again, I'm not an economist, but that every dollar spent, we hear this line a lot, every dollar spent once is spent multiple times. You hear the concept of multiples, where it may just be a certain number of production spend in a state, but it equates to multi-billion dollars of ultimate economic benefit. And I can't remember the Georgia quotes, but not every year the Georgia governor does a great job of talking about this is how much direct production spend we had, but it equated to like X billion of economic benefit to the state.
It'll be so interesting to see then how the current legislature in Georgia changes their business there and what the ripple effect is. I think it's fascinating to watch. We shall see.
We shall see. Well, I wanted to, again, going back to something that Amy said earlier about, because if you talk about the U.S., there are only states that have incentives. There really isn't technically a federal incentive. Like if you go to Canada, for example, there's a 16% federal, and then all the provinces have their own incentives. But there is, and is again, Section 181. And again, it's not a tax credit or a tax rebate, but it was a tax mechanism that independents utilized to finance movies. At the end of the day, it was really nothing more than an accelerated tax write-off. If a movie costs $1 million, for example, technically under tax law, you have to amortize that over the life of a movie. But 181 said that as long as you qualified, and to qualify was simple, as long as 75% or more of your crew base was U.S. based, not even U.S. citizens, you qualified. And so you could write off that $1 million in 1 year instead of over time.
So does that help the investors? Is that a tax write-off for them?
So basically what producers would do is they would create an investment company and sell those losses to investors. And those investments became a vehicle to finance movies.
It was more of an enticement to get investors to invest. It was a perk for the investor.
Because they were guaranteed something because they were buying passive losses. And if the movie made money, then they got their investment back. But at the very least, they were buying losses. and they could utilize those losses. Unlike tax credits, which is offset directly against taxes, if you're buying losses, it reduces your passive income. So you ultimately would pay less taxes.
Okay, we're getting complicated up in here.
And I won't bring up 167G, which is the new one, Code Section 167G.
Okay, you will in a second, though.
I think we should talk about, and Joe might be able to help with this, is when you are looking at various states and what they're offering, are they offering 20%, 25%, 30%? How does that affect if you do bring crew in, resident versus non-resident? There's a lot of different rules, state by state. They often will allow they'll allow you to get a credit on that out-of-state individual, but often less. If it's 20% for an out-of-state individual, but maybe 30% for an in-state individual, because they're trying to encourage you to hire residents, but so I know certain states are more generous with that than others.
So you have to get really detailed if you're doing a comparison and trying to figure out where you're going to go. If someone is just kind of doing this for the first time, what are the resources? How do they find out this information?
Well, there's a lot of places. A film commission is always a great source. But if you really wanted to go somewhere as a quick index, my company has a website, productionincentives.com, where we track all the domestic and international incentives. It's in real time, so it's really as current as it possibly can be. And it can give you a real snapshot of what states have in terms of what's the percentage, what's the minimum spend requirement, what happens with residents and non-residents, links to film commissions, links to legislation. So it's a great snapshot that you can at least get a sense of what makes sense. And you can do this comparison tools that you can use and say, does this make sense? And we try to even list the type of productions that qualify. Like, for example, in California, if I'm not mistaken, reality TV doesn't qualify. Right. Commercials don't qualify. So we try, but in New York, that all does. So that's a factor as well, depending on what's being produced.
So it sounds like you really have to do the work and do the due diligence. You can't say, my budget's $1 million, I get 20% in this state and 30% in that state. It doesn't work like that. You really have to look line by line and do the math.
Eventually.
Yes, absolutely. You have to do a detailed budget for each jurisdiction to really be able to make an educated decision.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to what Amy said earlier, I get literally hundreds of phone calls, and and sometimes they really don't know where they are in the process. And I said, let's talk about your project, and we try to figure out what locations might work based on creative needs. And then we kind of whittle down that list, and then said, you have an idea what your budget is, and then let's break it into 4 buckets. What does your labor cost look like above the line versus below the line? And just estimates. And then let's look at your production spend, actual production spend, and let's assume that you'll be able to get 50% of it in a certain jurisdiction. And then at least you can get a sense of what location might make sense. And now we've just added to our website a calculator that kind of does that at a very high level. But at the end of the day, you have to do a full-blown budget and really understand. And you're right, most people don't factor in the cost of seeking an incentive. They just don't. They do it purely based on, they take their California budget and they almost apply it to every other jurisdiction, and they make a certain assumptions that they're going to get the most versus making the assumption that they might not get the most.
Right, because remember, airfare and hotels and all of that kind of travel.
And every state's different on those airfares. Every state has a different airfare rule. Some states don't give you airfare. Some give you flights in, but not flights out. Some states you can fly in.
You can come, but you can't leave.
You can't leave.
But then also on the back end, the accounting of it all, like there's a whole process you need to go through with an audit and a CPA. Like there are a lot of costs on the back end. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in California, and a lot of the other states actually started to follow the California model, which is to require a third-party audit following specific audit procedures. So that it is a uniform audit, so to speak. And that cost is absorbed by the production to pay the CPA to do that. Free. Right. It's an added cost that you have to do. And there's a lot of paperwork, again, depending on the state, and there's a lot of tracking, very specific tracking. But if it's set up at the beginning, it's not that difficult to do.
But you probably do need to use a production accounting system, a production payroll company, so that you can generate all the reports that you need at the end. You're not trying to do this on Excel, even if you have a really little budget.
You absolutely have to. These systems are much more robust than just doing it in Excel, and the tagging is when I say tagging, like in movie budgeting software, there's ways to tag specific each little individual line item, which you certainly in California and a lot of the other states, you have to do it. You have to set it up that way to be able to track those costs.
So then you can sort it and do reports at
Correct.
the end. Very important.
And even on the payroll side, there are specific payroll reports that are required that I don't think just a simple Excel would be able to generate. There's a specifics that states require.
Right. And if you're paying people 1099s and just paying them, out of accounts payable, it's never going to work.
1099 is also, if you're paying somebody a 1099, you're typically not withholding on that income. And one of the requirements in most states is that if you're working in the state, that compensation has to be taxed.
Right.
And if it's not taxed, it doesn't qualify.
Do most states have a minimum budget requirement?
It varies. I mean, some states have no spend requirement. New Mexico doesn't have a minimum spend requirement at all.
So you could go in with your short that you're spending $12,000 on?
New York has a stage day, or they don't want you coming to New York just to film the streets of New York, so there's stage day requirements. Some are a percentage of budget. I think Georgia is 503 or 500,000. So there's usually a minimum spend. California, it's a way of weeding out you want to be able to weed out some of the folks and preserve what's there for the real productions.
Mm-hmm. Right. I've noticed, so California has a $1 million minimum spend. So that weeds out a lot.
Yeah.
But I've noticed that almost all the other states have a much lower threshold for that minimum spend.
Maybe
Right?
300,000.
Yeah, 300,000, 500,000. I've seen even like 50,000 in some places.
I can't remember which state is 50, but I'm almost positive New Mexico it's either 0 or 50, but I'm pretty sure it's 0.
Wow. All right, so if you're doing your little short and you want to get a little something, maybe go to New Mexico.
Well, that's another point, too. So are shorts eligible? And commercials, like Joe had mentioned. So in California, none of that's eligible.
Right.
If it's
But you're dealing with the big dogs here,
well,
Amy.
right. It was designed because it is a limited pot of funds and to how to make the best use of those dollars and who's really creating well-paying jobs. Right. So
long-term.
That are paying health insurance and all those kinds of great jobs that we want in California. But in other places, if you're doing a short or spec short or something, you can go other places to take advantage of those programs.
And I'm actually seeing a lot of really positive legislative changes that are still being rolled out. For example, New Mexico, it's always had a very great program, but what they've also done is they had $50 million a year of funding that they've raised to $110 million, which is going to be a game changer for them. Oklahoma just did something just passed this week. They raised their funding from $4 million to $8 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they've also added provision that if you have a film or a project that budget is $50 million or more, and you spend at least 1/3 of that in Oklahoma, you have no cap. They'll take your project. That's going to be a game changer.
Wait,
interesting.
On the Oklahoma spend or on the whole thing?
On Oklahoma spend.
Okay.
But your overall budget has to be 50, and you have to spend 1/3 of that in the state.
But essentially, they're not capped in that
scenario.
I see. Interesting.
Because I think people want the larger budget projects.
Sure.
And I think, especially with the streaming companies doing large budget projects where we're hearing episodes are 10 and 12 million each.
Isn't that crazy?
It's the reality. And and so if you have a small incentive, you're not even being looked at. But now if you have a budget this size, Oklahoma is now going to be on a short list of considerations. I think that's pretty great.
From where you guys are sitting, are you seeing any slowdown in the expansion of production that we're in the middle of right now?
Of production? No.
Yeah.
No.
Like with the Netflix and the Amazon, the Hulu and the Apple?
No, I'm not seeing a slowdown. No.
I mean, it's clear. Everything I'm not seeing it as an industry professional. Anything I'm reading, in fact, everything I'm reading is the real industry issue at the moment is the lack of crew and the lack of infrastructure on a worldwide basis.
Yeah, that's the concern.
Where you have so much content that we need to make, and we don't know where the people are going to come from. So I look at that as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a leveling off, though. It was like a huge increase, and I do think that we've kind of hit a plateau. Or are you still seeing?
I think we're maybe that in the U.S. maybe, but I think it's really exploding
internationally.
Again, this is not proprietary information, but I believe, like for example, with Netflix, of their 6 or 8 million, let's say they're spending 8 billion. I'm sorry, I believe 6 is being spent internationally. That's pretty significant.
That's a good point. There's a lot of native language production going on that all the companies are doing.
That's the
the
trend. They're creating hubs and creating local content for India, for Spanish-speaking territories, for Germany. That is the model. And the streaming companies have instant distribution.
Yeah.
And what I'm also hearing, and we see it ourselves as consumers, these productions are being made in such a way where, especially with streaming, it can be played anywhere, right? In that native language or dubbed to be played in English. That's really you're creating just unilateral inventory of product that can be played locally as well as enjoyed and consumed by people outside that country. It's pretty amazing.
It really is incredible. We're in such a boom. All right, what did I not ask you about that I should have asked you about?
I think we covered, we talked about the U.S., we didn't really get into a lot of the international territories. There's probably more growth in incentive opportunities internationally than there have. The U.S. has scaled back a bit, and I think the foreign territories continue to increase.
What are the hot countries right now?
Canada's always been hot. UK isn't hot. Ireland is red hot. Germany, Hungary. One of the most interesting incentives came out last summer. I can't believe it's almost a year. Romania introduced an incentive. It's a cash rebate. It's 35 to 45% residents and non-residents, above the line and below the line.
Labor only?
No, and spend.
Wow.
How are they going to sustain that?
And I believe, and again, this is my belief, listeners, because that region, whether it's Hungary and Czech Republic, are really busy. They needed to do something, maybe it's the Michigan model, to attract people from Hungary and the Czech Republic. So, Hungary is 30, Czech Republic is 25. So how do I compete? When Michigan came out, it was 40 to 42%.
How long did that Michigan one last?
2 to 4 years.
Yeah, I was going to say 4 years.
Do they have it at all anymore?
No.
Right. It was you can't sustain that.
Right.
You have to be able to, for the government, you have to be able to prove a positive return on investment somehow. And when you're giving 42%, you can't do it. It doesn't pencil out.
It's always also, and I did some research on this and there's articles about this, it's a 5 to 10 year investment until you actually see a return on investment. Georgia, everyone's talking Georgia. Well, Georgia started in 2006. And Georgia's been red hot, maybe 5 or 6 years?
Takes a while. Well, to get all the infrastructure there, I would
But it's about consistency, and this is a word I use a lot. Producers want to go someplace where the law is consistent, the funding is consistent, and the process is consistent, and that's probably the biggest issue that U.S. incentives have is the rules are always changing, while internationally they do not change as frequently. And if they do, it's usually an increase or a benefit to the program.
You don't want any risk around it.
No, you again, especially on the film side, you're planning years in advance to go somewhere. Going back to Georgia, studios have booked studios years in advance because they know they're going, and now they might not.
We'll see. Okay, what on the show we do our martini shot, which you guys know what that means, which is our last shot of the day. So what is your parting advice if there's one thing you really need to think about when looking at incentives?
Again, I'm just going to say what I said before, which is you can't just look at this one's offering 30%. What is it offering the 30% on? And really doing doing your homework with an actual line by line budget analysis.
That's it. Joe,
And I would add, don't believe the hype. People say things that aren't true based on either they had bad experiences or they did it wrong. For example, we mentioned North Carolina. People still think that North Carolina doesn't have an incentive. They absolutely have an incentive. But again, there was some press years ago that people remember what they remember. But so I say don't always believe the hype and then just go to the experts, go to companies like mine, go to really great production accountants, line producers. Film commissions are, again, a really great resource to get the lay of the land, what's going on locally.
I feel like we got such the insider tips here. Thank you guys so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on Season 2 of Catch a Break. We'd like to thank our guests, Amy Lemish and Joe Chianese. Please check out the website at catchabreakpodcast.com and follow us on all the social media. Catch a Break is produced in partnership with Catchlight Films, Rose Colored Pictures, and the Other 50%. And it is also sponsored by Crewvie, an online solution for producers to find and promote local crew and production support worldwide. Find them at crewvie.com. And thank you to Andrew Jocelyn, who created our theme music, Mantra for a Struggling Artist. We hope you've enjoyed listening and learning more about breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry with Catch a Break.